O'Casey Centre. I recognise most faces, I think people have been here before, but for anyone who hasn't, just so you know, the name Sean O'Casey Centre comes about obviously because Sean O'Casey lived in this area for a large part of his life. He lived in this area at the formative years when the lockout took place, the 1911 rail strike, which he would have had some involvement with, and the 1916 Rising. He said in his autobiography that he performed plays in his house on Hawthorne Avenue when he was a kid, for probably the first theatricals in the area. We have a photograph from 1941. This was the site of the boys' school from the 30s. We have a photograph from 1941 of the kids performing the play Ali Baba and 40 Thieves. So as early as 41, this site here was a theatre. And when this building when this was being designed in the last decade, there was people in the community that insisted that a theatre space be included. And I think it's fairly unique in a community in this city to have such a fully kitted out theatre arena. What I would say is that the centre is available for rent. There's also rehearsal spaces, there's facilities for conferences here. So the centre are very good in facilitating events by the history group. So if you have any events coming up, consider using it. Just a couple of very quick things. There's books for sale over there. There's some trade union history books. There's some books from Centenary Publishing, which is based in East Wall. And they're all at a reduced price from what you would pay in the shop. So have a look before you go. There's also John's book, I do believe. And again, all the events that we have are deliberately, we keep them free. We don't charge into anything because the stories that we're telling, the history that we're passing on, belongs to everybody, and we don't believe in charging. But things do cost us, the publicity, as you saw, the high quality posters we use, etc. So we are having a raffle. Sarah will be selling tickets, so please dip in. There's a selection of books, I forgot the wine, so it's books only for prize, but they're good books. And without further ado, we have a couple of things to do at the end of the night when John is finished. There'll be a song, a revolutionary song, and then there'll be a small theatrical that will bridge the gap between the period we're talking about, the Maguires, and our own big labour event in 1914. So when it comes to the end of the night, we'll have the raffle and there's a couple of things to wrap up on. And with that, I'll pass on to Sarah.
I'm afraid to touch the mic because I'm going to break it and John said a lot taller than me, so I'm just going to yell. What if I... Microphones generally hate me. And when they see me approaching, they like to fall over, so I apologise in advance for destroying the microphone. My name is Sarah, and I'm from East Wall History Group and Centenary, which is a not-for-profit publishing house based here in East Wall. And we're delighted to take advantage of John on his trip to Ireland to give this talk and some literary readings as well yesterday. As Joe said, this is the Sean O'Casey Centre. And the combination of Sean O'Casey, who used political events and his experience of things that were going on around him in his work, with the location here, which is in the North Docklands. And there's two particular types of communities that would have a lot in common in relation to things like strikes, like fighting for their rights, and the kind of solidarity that goes with that in certain places. And that would be actually dockers and miners. So there's a tremendous kind of overlap here, and there's often support between dockland areas and mining communities. Even here in the 1980s, the English dockers did come over and they landed at North Wall, and there was support given to them from here. So I think it's very significant that what we're addressing is events that took place in mining communities, and in mining communities where there were Irish and Irish Americans involved, because there is a correlation in strike rights. But also, obviously, the Maguires were more than just labour activists. They were a secret society, and we're a country obviously that loves our secret societies, even though we don't really talk about them that much because, well, they're secret. So I think there's lots of different aspects of this talk that we're going to be really interested in. But also John himself. John is actually a novelist, poet and a playwright. So like O'Casey, the namesake of this theatre, he used his knowledge, his research, and his own personal experience, having grown up not too far, so geographically, from the mine, because Pennsylvania. he used that experience to write a play, as O'Casey did before him. So there's a lot of overlap there. Now I'm just going to start with a quote from John's play about the Molly Maguires and Sons of Molly Maguire. Now this actually calls for Shanachie to chant, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave that to Dermot Brathnach later. So I'm just going to read this, and hopefully I will do some sort of justice to it. It's the song of the anthracite coal miner, and it's from John Kearns' play Sons of Molly Maguire. Sit a rich man next to a beggar, and he'll ever be blind to his pain. The landlord he knocked down our house for to buy another case of champagne. 'Twas hunger that drove me away from me land, to rock on the raging sea. Now the same master drives me down underground, where only the damned used to be. So each morning at dawn the helmet goes on, and I go down to the mines. The sun that still sets, it simply forgets, we lads who ne'er see it shine. The turf back at home you can break in your hands. Its aroma's like something to eat. Down in the steerage, it remains for weeks on my clothes, and kept the loss of my land incomplete. I got a job mining the hardest of all, the black stone of anthracite coal. Great heat and pressure create coal from turf, and likewise can harden the soul. So each morning at dawn, the helmet goes on, and I go down to the mines. The sun it still sets, it simply forgets, we lads who ne'er see it shine. The hills of Pennsylvania, so they often tell me, are the sisters of Kearns, and is lovely to see. They climb and they dive like the hills back at home, so green is their grass, but so grey are their stones. But to me they are nothing, for like the roots of a tree, I dig down in the earth and set anthracite free. So each morning at dawn, the helmet goes on, and I go down to the mines. The sun, it still sets, it simply forgets, we lads who ne'er see it shine. Coal's near as valued as diamonds, and feeds the machines of their wars. The whistle of their locomotives is the monster a-crying for more. The gold dust that parches our noses and throats, making even us gales wish for rain. In the dark pits we dream of soft days and cool air and the digging of turf once again. So each morning at dawn, the helmet goes on, and I go down to the mines. The sun, it still sets, it simply forgets, we lads who ne'er see it shine. The rich man, he has a fine house, and clothing and jewellery galore, but the bounty of suffering and hardship is held in trust by the poor. The landlord, he knocked down our homes for to buy another case of champagne. Sit a rich man next to a beggar, and he'll ever be blind to his pain. Ní higan an seach an sean, the well-fed doesn't understand the hungry. Ní higan an seach an sean. John Kearns.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank Sarah and everybody, and Oren and everybody from Seven Towers, and also from the East Wall History Project for having me here. And as Sarah mentioned, it's a big thrill for me to be here at the Sean O'Casey Center because I'm a playwright myself, and there's no question that I think one of the reasons why first thought of writing a play was because of Sean O'Casey, and so it's a big thrill for me to be here, and also to be here in the city, which is a famous city of talkers, and the greatest talkers since the Greeks, right? So that you're here listening to me talk is a great honor for me, so I'm very grateful. So thank you for having me. I want to talk about the Molly Maguires, as you know, and the title of my talk is Myth, History, and Mystery, because I think there's the myth, which is famous, the famous story, the very dramatic story of what happened to the Molly Maguires, the secret society that were in Pennsylvania, that were infiltrated by the Pinkerton detectives, and ended with the dramatic hangings of 20 of them in 1877 through 1879, and 10 of them in one day. And we're lucky to have this banner here, which actually depicts what they call the Day of the Rope of the 21st of June, 1877. So there's a real connection here between Ireland and America. And also, it's interesting, the other day I was in Kilrush, County Clare, and I saw the monument to the Manchester martyrs, and I saw the phrase, "they had been judicially murdered," and I thought, that was a great phrase for the Molly Maguires, and then here it is on this banner, same phrase, judicially murdered. So that's the myth, and then there's the history, which is obviously questions a lot of the accounts that we have, because the accounts that we have of the Molly Maguires are all written by people who were against the Molly Maguires, who wanted to crush them. We're talking about the newspapers, the prosecutors, and everyone, the mine owners, and a lot of these people work together. And it's a very one-sided story that's been handed down to us. The so-called Molly Maguires themselves were illiterate, or they spoke Irish. They couldn't write in English, and they didn't really leave any written records that we can compare against this story of conspiracy that the mine owners and the newspapers have told us about. So. And then, yeah, so that's the mystery part of it. So there's the history questions, the myth, and then the mysteries that in some ways we might never know the answers to some of these questions. So, Oren, can we have the next slide? That basically just does the same what I just explained. Next one, please. All right, so it starts with the roots. We can start with the roots here in Ireland. Back, as Sarah mentioned, there's a history of secret societies from all the way back to the United Irishmen, and the Ribbon Men, the White Boys, the Oak Boys, and the list goes on and on. And it's interesting from a number of levels because I think from the time perhaps of the United Irishmen, people thought that there was the way to get what they needed or what they wanted to get done is to take extra legal methods. Right? The legal system was not working for them, legal methods were not helping, so they had to go outside the law to try to accomplish their goals. And so the other thing that's interesting about this, sociologically and theatrically, I think, about these secret societies is that they also, a lot of them dressed up in costumes. And there was actually a good deal of cross-dressing. These men dressed up as women when they went out to commit their acts of violence or to frighten people. And so it's an interesting sociological study. Someone should really look into this. Why? And they said actually that compared to other European societies, the Irish secret societies dressed up as women more often than any other European country. So I don't know. But I think they possibly associated, for whatever reason, they associated the feminine with the irrational, with violent, with things that were out of control. And so there was a way for them to act out their crazy thing. And the way that they operated essentially was through the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania, and I think in Ireland, followed the same sort of method. They would follow. They would send out coffin notices to people who they sort of believed had somehow broken some social contract. You know, that somehow they had done something wrong and that they deserved to be punished. And so they would warn them and say, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, this little coffin I'm drawing here is going to be your home if you don't stop doing this. And then they would follow through on those threats. Okay, and basically, one of the best books about this subject is by Kevin Kenny. It's called Making Sense of the Molly Maguires. And he uses the term retributive justice. And I think that's basically this method of saying, you know, you've broken the social contract, we're going to punish you. We're going to get justice through going outside the law, and we're going to punish you ourselves. Okay. So, and one of the big myths is like, who was Molly Maguire? So there are three different stories for who Molly Maguire was. And I think the most popular one was that she was a victim of the Great Hunger, whose husband died, and then she was evicted from her home with her children, and she was found later, she and the children were found later starved and frozen to death. So that the secret society named themselves after her in honor of her to get revenge. And there are other stories too, that she was the owner of a shebeen where conspiracies were formed and discussed. And there's also a third story that she was sort of a vigilante herself, who would go out at night and get revenge on landlords and other offending characters. And now, so who are the major players of this story? There's several of them. There's Franklin Gowan, who is the the president of the Reading Railroad. He also ended up being the prosecutor in a lot of the trials. He was one of the big figures behind going after the Molly Maguires and making sure that they got the death penalty. There was also another man, Asa Packer, who was the president of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And he was quieter, but he didn't seem to like the limelight as much as Gowan did. But he might have been just as guilty. He might have actually been the guy behind the whole thing. Some people think that he might have been the motivating person behind going after the Molly Maguires to begin with. And these men both had a lot to gain from crushing the so-called Molly Maguires and crushing the unions and the Ancient Order of Hibernians, because they wanted to control the coal mining, taking the coal out of the ground. And they also owned the railroads that would transport the coal from the coal fields of upstate Pennsylvania to Philadelphia and to New York. So they had a lot to gain by crushing any kind of resistance they might have to their sort of grandiose plans. So one of the other major characters was John Siney, who was the founder of the Working Men's Benevolent Association, and he was born in Ireland, I think in County Laois, and he was a peaceful man. He was not involved in violence at all, and the union constantly condemned any kind of violence and tried to prevent violence from occurring. But they still were labeled by Gowan and the others as all Molly Maguires, violent. Union, Ancient Order of Hibernians, and Mollies are all the same thing. And then James McParland was the man who was the Pinkerton detective who infiltrated the so-called Molly Maguires, became a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and was able to become the so-called Molly Maguire, became the secretary, because he could read and write. And then he was the primary witness that got a lot of them convicted. Okay, and then Jack Kehoe was the so-called king of the Mollies, who he was actually a remarkable story, because he started off as a miner and was able to work his way up in an atmosphere of great prejudice and poverty and difficulty. He was able to save enough money to get out of the mines, open up his own tavern called the Hibernia House, which was a gathering place for the Irish and for his community. And he became a community leader, as a lot of tavern owners are or were. And he also became involved in politics. He was involved in helping one of the governors get elected. He was elected the high constable of his town, Gerardville, twice. So he was an important person, and the fact that he was targeted as the so-called Molly Maguire shows that Gowan was trying to wipe out some important people in the community, in a way. Okay, and then the last one is Alex Campbell, whose story is also similar. He was another man who started out as a miner, worked his way out, owned his own bar, became a community leader, and he was the man who was the famous story in Pennsylvania. When he was about to be hanged, he was when the sheriff came to take him out of the jail cell, he put his hand on the ground, got some dirt on his hand, and slapped it up on the wall. He said, "I'm going to die an innocent man, and this handprint will stay here to prove that, to prove my innocence." And if you go there today, the handprint is still there on the wall since 1877. Okay, next slide. This is a timeline of events, probably hard for you to read, but I have some copies printed up there on the table over there. This is generally the timeline from 1847 to 1848, the time of the famine, when Irish immigrants first came to the coal fields, all the way through to 1878, when Jack Kehoe was hanged. That's too small. And here are the 10 murders that the Molly Maguires were accused of committing. And if you notice, in the middle column, there's what they all did for a living. And most of them seemed to be bosses, mine bosses, foremen, superintendents. And there were a few government officials, so some policemen, judges, people like that. But for the most part, they seem to be people who were in the workplace who were abusing, or seemed to be abusing abusing the miners. Okay, so then the general myth that Gowan and the newspapers and the first few books that have been handed down to us tell us it's kind of a wild story that the Molly Maguires were actually imported as an organization from Ireland into America, and that there was this shadowy organization called the Board of Erin, and that they were answering to. And I've been looking around Dublin for it. I haven't been able to find it. And then basically that the struggle of the Molly Maguires was a continuation of the nationalistic, Catholic, Irish struggle against the British imperialism, against Protestantism, and then, as I said before, that the WBA, the AOH, and the Molly Maguires are all the same. So those are some of the basic myths. And that basically that the Molly Maguires had this reign of terror over the coal fields, the whole area of upstate Pennsylvania, and that there were these murderous thugs, and that once the brave man McParland infiltrated them and was able to make sure that they were prosecuted and hanged, that peace came over the upstate Pennsylvania coal fields. Then on the other side of this, there are people who are pro-Molly Maguires, would say that the whole thing was a myth, that there was no such thing as a Molly Maguires, it was made up, that they were all innocent of what they were convicted of, and that McParland was an agent provocateur who actually encouraged these guys to go out to kill people, and so that he could make sure he got the convictions. And that the Molly Maguires were purely just an act of, the Molly Maguires hangings were purely an act of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish hysteria. Right? So I think, basically the truth, as in so many cases, lies somewhere in the middle. Right? That there possibly was. We don't know for sure if there really was an organization called the Molly Maguires. But if it was a separate organization that was started in Pennsylvania. I think what we had was immigrants from central and north and central Ireland, many of them from Donegal, who found themselves in similar situations to what they had had at home, and they responded in a similar way by forming a secret society, by sending coffin notices to offending bosses and attacking them. And often when the strikes and the unions were strong and things were working, the violence decreased. It was only when the strikes fell apart and the union was weakened or almost destroyed that the violence increased again. And also the violence was local, sometimes it was just ethnic, sometimes it was just people on a payday, they would be paid and they would go out and start drinking, get into a fight with some Welsh people, maybe someone would get killed, and that would be labeled a Molly Maguire, some part of Molly Maguire conspiracy. And again, if there were Mollies, they were part of the AOH, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, they were part of the Union, but they were a minority. They certainly were not, all three organizations were certainly not one and the same. And the Mollies were not actually part of any kind of Catholic struggle because the Catholic Church was very much against them and condemned them very strongly, especially the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And some more facts, the crime rate basically before the day of the rope, before all the hangings and these convictions of Molly Maguires, stayed about the same. There was no great reign of terror that suddenly ended when these hangings occurred. And that, as I mentioned before, there was a long strike of 1875, and the Workers' Benevolent Association ran the strike from January to June of 1875. And as they had control over the strikers and the miners, things were peaceful. But it's just toward the end of it, when the strikes started to fall apart, they started to lose control, and as they said, the Irish element started to take over, where the violence came back again. And then when the strike fell apart completely, then we had an outburst of violence where there were six more murders. And McParland, his role is quite suspect because he might have known about some of the killings beforehand and might have been able to warn people to get out of there or to protect them in some way, but he claimed that his own life would have been in danger if he did that. And his role was quite suspect. And later on in life, he was in another case where he was testifying against miners in Colorado, and Clarence Darrow was the lawyer for the defense, who basically tore McParland apart on the stand and called him a professional liar and said, and so his reputation was ruined after that. But so unfortunately, the Molly Maguires did not have Clarence Darrow to defend them. Okay, next. All right, so basically, here's the way that the conditions the miners found themselves in Pennsylvania in the 1860s and 1870s. There were three different levels. There was the there were the miners, who were the skilled people who were almost like artisans or craftsmen, and they saw the coal as something they produced. It was a product that they had that they were selling to the bosses. So they were paid actually by the amount of coal they produced rather than by the hour or by the day or whatever. Then you had the laborers who were basically just, after the coal had been sort of blasted out of the mine, they would just kind of shovel it and fill up the carts that would bring the coal up to be weighed. And then we had the boys. We had young children as young as 8 years old. They didn't have any rules about how young they had to be for a while. And then I think in the 1870s they said they had to be 12 to be inside the mine. And then they didn't have any rules about working on the surface. And then finally, later they said, I think they raised that to 12 too. So the conditions were very bad. And there were 3,980 children, young boys working in the mines in 1870. All right, and this is important to the story because these three levels of labor actually break down, or the two levels really, break down strictly along ethnic lines as well. Because predominantly the skilled miners were British or Welsh, and the laborers tended to be Irish. And if you were Welsh, you had a great ability to move up quickly. You could work a couple months and become as a laborer and move up and become a miner. Right? But the Irish tended to work for years and years and would never get a chance. So there was real discrimination against them because they were the newest wave of immigrants, because they were Catholic, and because they were unskilled. And so they were kept down. So that was part of the reason that caused some of this violence as well. Next. Right, now the different waves of violence. There was a wave of violence in the 1860s, around and after the American Civil War. And then, as I mentioned before, when the Union got stronger in the 1870s, 1875, things were somewhat peaceful until the long strike fell apart. And then toward the end of that, and then at the collapse of that strike, the violence became much worse. And then some of the violence, as I mentioned before, some of the violence was not that they called Molly Maguire violence. Might have been just mob violence, might have been just people fighting, and it was not really part of any kind of conspiracy. And as I said, the Catholic Church was very much against the Molly Maguires, the biggest, and the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And their biggest complaint was that even to be a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which was a peaceful organization, although it was claimed to be one and the same as the Molly Maguires, was that they took secret oaths, and the church did not like that. The church condemned them, said that if you were a member of these organizations, you could be excommunicated. So they're very strongly opposed to it. And the church in Philadelphia was far away from the coal mines and was kind of out of touch with what people were feeling and experiencing there. But they were very strong in condemning these secret societies and these secret oaths. And at one point, the precedent for this was that back in Ireland, the ribbonmen had been condemned. And so they took that as a precedent and did the same thing. And then there was a publication of the Declaration of Seven Pastors, Catholic pastors in the upstate coal mines and area, and they published in the newspaper a condemnation of the Molly Maguires, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and any Catholic who would become part of an organization that had a secret oath. So here's the story of the long strike, as I mentioned. So in the beginning of 1875, Franklin Gowan offered a contract to the miners, which was 10 to 20% less than what they had been paid before. And the members of the Workers' Benevolent Association decided that they were not willing to accept that. Some miners were. They were willing to just go along with it and continue to have a job. But the WBA, which consisted of a lot of the Irish miners, decided that they wanted to strike. So they had a long strike that lasted from January until June. And the union, as I said, always came out in public condemning violence, saying that they were not using violent tactics, they were using non-violence, they were using strikes to try to get what they wanted. And I think they won people over, their rank and file over to that method for the longest time. But it's just as the strike wore on, and especially as it looked like there was really not even much negotiation going on, Gowan wouldn't talk to them, then the violence started to come back, I think, with the frustration. And then eventually they suffered a bitter defeat. By June of that year, they had to basically take the contract that they had from 1874 and just accept it. And they said they only accepted it because of the pangs of hunger. And so it was just the frustration and bitterness of that led to even more violence. All right, so then we have Franklin Gowan and James McFarland, who got this, a friend of mine named Kevin McFarland. They succeeded in arresting them and bringing them to trial and getting these convictions. And once the trial was going on, they were extremely unfair. Right? And as I said, Gowan and Asa Packer had great motivations for wanting to get rid of the unions and get rid of any kind of resistance to their grandiose plans. They were trying to connect the coal mines to the railroads and control the whole thing. And so they wanted to get rid of it. Clearly, it was to their benefit to get as many people, to get any kind of resistance out of the way. As I said, the targets of these were often the community leaders like Alex Campbell, like John Kehoe, and they seemed to want to get rid of any kind of prominent member of the Irish community that was fighting back against them. And so they sort of tarred them all with the same brush and said all these organizations were the same, and they were all violent thugs, and they just had to be destroyed. So, and Gowan acted as the prosecutor in the courtroom, as I said, and there wasn't a single Irish Catholic that was picked for any of the juries of any of these trials. And some of the jurors actually didn't even speak English; they spoke German and didn't know much English at all. And so, and there was a huge kind of anti-Catholic, anti-Irish feeling in the area anyway. So they brought in a hanging judge. Gowan acted as the prosecutor. The jurors were all people that were, anti-Irish if they could understand English. So someone said it was they were public executions, but it was a private trial, privately run trial with public execution. So one of the other things that was really suspect about these trials is that they relied so heavily on informers. They had, of course, McFarland, who had been part of who had infiltrated the group as James McKenna, but there were also people like Jimmy Kerrigan, and it was Ed Kelly, who were captured and arrested, and they decided to turn informers so they wouldn't face the hangman. So most of the evidence was based on informers, and so it was a very suspect trial, and all the trials were suspect in a lot of ways. And in the newspapers at the time, we had basically the 25 newspapers that were covering the trials and the hangings and everything, and they're all basically, telling the same story, shouting the same myth about the Maguires. There'd been a reign of terror throughout the coal region, and these people the police were brave to even arrest these people and bring them into court, and all we had to do was get rid of them, and we bring peace back to the area. So they really didn't stand much of a chance once they got into the courtroom. And one thing I wanted to say before I get to the actual hanging, interesting thing that was going on with all this too, especially with regard to the Catholic Church, is that I think what was happening with this story, we can see in hindsight, is that Irish America in some way was trying to define itself. And a lot of these people that were so-called Molly Maguires were from the more remote parts of Ireland. They were Irish-speaking. They practiced a form of religion which was outside the mainstream. They still had the ancient Celtic ways of practicing religion, certain wakes and things like that the Catholic Church was trying to eradicate. And so even within the Irish American community, they were seen as outsiders. The Irish American community was becoming urban, more middle class. Even by 1877, they were practically running New York City, probably. And most of the cops and firemen and teachers and people in the city, running the city, especially City Hall, were probably Irish or Irish American. So these wild sort of murderous characters in the coal fields of Pennsylvania were seen as kind of outsiders even by the Irish community. And I think the Catholic Church, the devotional revolution that was taking place in Ireland after the Great Hunger, was influencing what was going on in Pennsylvania as well. So they were trying to standardize and Romanize all of the religious practices. So I think there was many forces here that were kind of lining up against these people that were called Molly Maguires. All right, so on the 21st of June in 1877, 10 men were hanged, and even though they were had already gone to confession and already had last rites, most of them still protesting their innocence as they were walking to the gallows. So they believed that they were innocent, and they spoke out for their innocence. Now, there were two different sites on the day they called the Day of the Rope. There was the Maw-Chunk, which became Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and there's also Pottsville. And in Pottsville, things were somewhat respectful toward the families and toward the men who were going to be executed. But in Maw-Chunk, it was really kind of a circus. They let children, the children and the families of the murder victims come into the jail, play around on the gallows, which were just a few feet away from where the men were sitting in the jail cells. And they were jumping around, playing on the gallows, and they had there was a guy who came in and measured all the men who were being hanged for their coffins. And he had the coffin shop. He had all the coffins in the windows with the names of the men that were going to be hanged. So when the families came to visit, they had to pass by this shop, seeing this. And it was just sort of a big tourist attraction, a big sort of festival atmosphere. And the sheriff there allowed all this to happen, whereas in Pottsville he was a little bit more respectful. There's one interesting story. There's a priest named Father McDermott, who had been I think he was one of the pastors who wrote that declaration against the Maguires, against secret societies, and had always been against them in public. But when it came time for the men to be executed, he was caught in a kind of funny place, because the men were condemned. They had been condemned by the church, but he felt that he had to still counsel them and give them their last rites and all that sort of thing. And just before the men were about to be hanged, he came out and said, "I've been talking to these guys, taking their confessions, and I actually have to publicly say I believe that they're innocent." But they went to the gallows anyway. So there's all kinds of evidence on the day itself that these convictions were suspect and the executions should not have happened. Okay, and this again brings us to the question of the mystery of the Maguires, the fact that in some ways we'll never know what happened, because the men who were, except for the handprint on the wall, the men who were hanged didn't really leave any records that we can compare against articulate lawyers like Gowan, or the newspapers that were screaming, for these men's execution. So, some ways, we can analyze the evidence a little bit better than what existed at the time. We can question what the early accounts that were all based on, the prosecutor's accounts and the detective's accounts. But in some ways, we'll never know exactly. And I did a little interview here before the talk, and they were asking me, the first question they asked was there an organization called the Maguires? And we don't really know for sure. If it's possible that the whole thing was made up by Gowan and Asa Packer. Like I said, the history of the writing about this subject has been very suspect as well. Basically, most people have accepted the first books that were written were by Alan Pinkerton and by Gowan himself. And so and that sort of set the stage. And then every book that was written after that had kind of accepted that sort of party line and repeated that. And until recently, there's a book in 1998. There's a book by Kevin Kenny, as I mentioned. It's called "Making Sense of the Maguires," which really takes a balanced and scholarly approach to all this, and even to the history of where the organizations came from, and analyzing specifically where these immigrants came from and what their experiences were. So I highly recommend that book. Next, please. So what were the after effects of this on the labor movement? There's a clear setback for the labor movement. In 1877, there was a big strike that went across many different states, different industries, but upstate Pennsylvania was quiet. There were no strikes there, because I think they'd been so demoralized by all this. And so it really set things back. They didn't really get, the Working Men's Benevolent Association didn't get back on its feet after this. And there were new organizations that started called the Knights of Labor and the Miners Amalgamated Association. So and they didn't really get going with any strength until the end of that decade. So, and as I said, Irish America sort of became redefined at the end after this, and the identity that they had for themselves was to be urban, middle class, educated, traditionally practicing Catholic, and these sort of wild Irish that were labeled as Maguires were sort of pushed out, and actually hanged and condemned by the society. And here's some suggested reading, bibliography. As I mentioned, the Kevin Kenny book is probably the best one. The book by Patrick Campbell, the second one on the list, is an interesting book because it's written by a man who wrote for the Irish Echo in New York. And he'd grown up in Donegal and heard stories about his granduncle, Alex Campbell, and the hanging and the handprint on the wall and all that sort of thing. And so as an adult, he later on, after he emigrated to America, he decided to research this issue. So it's kind of his personal story about researching the story, finding out more about his uncle, and finding out more about the trials and things like that. And that was written in the early 90s, and that's an interesting story as well. All right, so are there any questions on this? And I think there are a lot of comparisons between the long strike in Pennsylvania and the lockout here in Dublin, and also the whole story about the Maguires and the setback for the labor movement, which I think happened in that story and in the Dublin lockout as well.
Sorry, can I ask? I'm a little bit
Sure.
puzzled at a few things you've presented there. One is I can't understand why the Welsh wouldn't have been equally affected by the cuts in their wages. And okay, they were higher up the scale in terms of jobs, but why would they not have equally wanted to strike in view of the fact that their wages were being cut?
I think they did in the beginning, and that there were earlier strikes, and I think that a lot of the ethnic groups sort of went along with it. But in that particular strike, there was John Siney, who had started the Working Men's Benevolent Association, started a different union, and he really wanted to shy away from striking. I guess maybe it was too hard on the people, and so. And the Welsh, I think, and the Irish, I think, were a little bit angrier because it was harder for them to move up. And also the Welsh were their bosses who would sometimes cheat them out of how much coal they were taking out of the mines and things like that. So maybe they had certain advantages, and their anger was not quite as much. But there were times when the various ethnic groups did work together.
You also said about people distancing themselves, the middle class, Irish who wanted to get up the scale. But 60% of people who emigrated from Ireland were Presbyterian and Protestant. They weren't Catholic at all. If you look back at some of the of the American presidents,
right,
and the present one
throughout American history, yeah.
He was a Protestant background. So
the Presbyterians.
Can I just ask, sorry to interrupt, can I just ask people who are asking questions, one, don't cut across, but if people use the roving mic, I'll bring it around because Baz is recording this, and if you don't use the mic, you might sound great, but we won't pick it up, so I just ask. John can point out who he wants to talk, and I'll run out of the mic. That's okay, John. Sorry.
But I guess the period that I'm talking about is after the Great Hunger, when the great wave of mostly Catholic immigrants sort of flooded into the eastern seaboard of America. So I think that period. But yeah, you're right. Over the course of all of American history, there were a lot of Protestant Irish who immigrated as well.
Just a question, looking back on mine, so I think it was very, very good, the coverage of the Maguires. It was just at a later stage in history that union movement at that time was broken, but later on in the late 1800s, a new movement developed, and it was just as regards to what was the composition of the Maguires with the AOH. Now, well, as we know in this country, and a reference James Connolly made to the AOH was the ancient order of hooligans, which smashed up trade union meetings. Now, they were very sectarian in America also, and they only wanted to link up for the Irish question and not to continue on the social issues with other people from other countries and religions, Just want to make that point.
I think also, from what I read, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, after the Maguires hangings, really tried to make themselves seem as respectable as possible. So they didn't want to have they want to distance themselves from any association with, and probably with the whole labor movement for that reason. I think they just wanted to be Catholic, middle class, and away from any kind of labor questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered, I mean, a very interesting presentation, thank you, very fascinating. Well, how much state collusion was there to allow somebody like Gavin, who obviously had a severe conflict of interest, how was he allowed to be prosecuted? Was that standard, or was there a state agenda to let somebody like him be able to basically have his own way with the trial and to do all of the things that you were suggesting he did?
Well, I think, well, he was an attorney, so I mean, he was sort of a legitimate person to have there in the courtroom, but I think maybe because these were sort of newer communities, they were often sort of being built by corporations in a sense. I mean, even the police, there was a police force called the Coal and Iron Police that was paid for by mine owners. So there's a mixture of public and private, and maybe because it was sort of a new territory in a sense, things were sort of wild and not quite settled, and somehow he was able to get away with that. But it certainly doesn't seem like standard practice, and it doesn't seem like anything we would, I hope we wouldn't tolerate today.
So there's no evidence historically, I mean, nobody's uncovered any documentation to suggest that, say, the Pennsylvania government had a hand in how the trial was run. That it was the railroads and the coal mining companies that were controlling.
Yeah, I think it was just these industrialists that had enough power to be able to just sort of throw their weight around. And I think, there were probably some good politicians who would stand to benefit from getting rid of the Maguires and sort of being on the side of big business. I think that was part of it as well.
Thanks very much. I think it would be usual for workers, wherever they are, to be able to use whatever organisation they could lay their hands on in order to, further their aims. So I don't think we should be astonished that the Maguires used the ancient order of Hibernians. And the Irish had a long tradition in agrarian societies, long before the United Irishmen, of secret societies. And in fact, that shouldn't surprise us either, because even today there are places where you can get sacked for trying to start a union. And I remember working in a foundry, and there was a guy there who told me that he collected the union subs by sidling up to people and turning his back and holding his hand behind his back for the subs. And that was in England. But I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the stuff you were saying. There's basically three questions. One, did you say that Edward Kelly was, an informer, or that he collapsed or something like that? Because he's actually mentioned in a song as one of the men who was hung, and that could be wrong, of course, but I'd be interested to know. That's one question. The other question as well is about the McPartland. I read some stuff about this some time back, and it said there were actually more than one McPartland, that there were two brothers. And I don't know whether you know anything about that. And the third one is about the kind of anti-Welsh feeling, which in the film with Sean Connery and Richard Harris was very well kind of underlined. But again, that's standard capitalist and imperialist practice to kind of give one section privileges over another, and that wouldn't be that unusual either.
Right. I did hear about the two brothers. That's in Patrick Campbell's book. When Patrick Campbell went to investigate about his uncle, he found out that there was evidence that there were two other McPartland brothers that were undercover, and that's why he says he could have gotten warning to some of these victims. I think it was Jones was one of them, and Gower James, I think Gomer James. So he said there were two murders that he feels that could have been prevented because he knows that he had other undercover agents that his brother was in the area, and so he sort of let these killings happen so that he could get the convictions later on. Sorry, what was your first question? Kelly, yeah, it's possible I'm looking at it. Was it Kelly? They called him Kelly the Bum, he was arrested and he was going to be hanged, and he decided to turn informer. But it might have been, I might have gotten the first name.
It was true, Kelly.
Yeah, probably it was Kelly that was hanged.
Yeah, you was hanged.
Yeah, and the Kelly that was an informer. Any other questions? Yeah. Chair.
Thanks, John. It was great. You were absolutely magnificent. Fascinating.
Thank you.
I just have to say, it would be nice if there was a great history about the gear that the original Molly Maguires in Ireland wore at the time of the famine. It was quite basic, actually. The reason they wore the women's clothing because it was very long on one hand, and there were big white bonnets at the time of that, which would well cover the face. Also, under the dresses and the aprons, you could much easier hide a blunderbuss or a shotgun or a revolver or a sword or a shillelagh. It's actually that basic, I'm afraid. It'd be nice if there was a bigger mystery.
Yeah, I think I was obviously there was reasons of disguise was part of it, but there was also it seemed like there was some sort of cultural thing going on as well. Yeah, because there were numbers, and they would paint their faces black, and sometimes they would paint their faces white. Different things. That's why I think theatrically it could be very interesting if you do another production of the play and really go into the costumes and everything. It's a whole, and I think it goes back to the roots of the sort of the mummers in Ulster, and even the Wren boys on St. Stephen's Day, of sort of coming in disguise, demanding coming to someone's house and saying and demanding something from them. So there's sort of connections, but yeah, for practical reasons as well. Yes, sir.
Thanks, very interesting talk. I'm just interested in the current perceptions of the Molly Maguires, because up on the East Wall for All they have a cartoon that was done by one of the trade unions recently, and they're trying to go along with the script that it was all a conspiracy against the Irish community and there was no Molly Maguires and innocent men were killed. And I wonder, is there still an attempt by people in the labour movement in America to claim that this was a conspiracy against them and that there wasn't any Molly Maguires, or and then is it what sort of people would still be pushing the idea that this was an Irish secret society, or is it still any political divisions on it? Because like in an Irish context there often is attempts to claim that there isn't some sort of conspiracies on the labour side of the issues when there is, and like organised violent activity with labour disputes is a constant in Irish history, as in many other histories. But I'm just wondering if there is still any sort of political connotations about the story of the Molly Maguires.
I don't know if it's political, but I think it probably breaks down along ethnic lines. I think if you ask probably German people or Welsh people, they might, descendants of these people, that they might think that they were murderous thugs, and if you ask Irish people, they would say they were innocent victims that were judicially murdered. So I think it breaks down that way. I don't know if it's really political. I know after this happened, whenever the labor movement would get stronger, then people in the press and powerful men in business would try to accuse whatever union was starting to rise up by calling it, these are Molly Maguires. So for a while in the 19th century, it was a label that was a damning label to labor unions. But I don't know if it comes up very much anymore.
Another case of rail workers, was it around Pennsylvania? And they've just...
Have to use the mic. We get around that.
Okay.
And just James Connolly and the Citizen Army, a lot of us that will come from that socialist Republican background would support the notion of workers, especially in the past, would needed military support, against the bosses, and so maybe we are inclined to believe that maybe the Molly Maguires, behind them, maybe there were people who took that tradition before we see the Citizen Army over to America, and he saw a need to protect workers against the excesses of capitalism and the bosses, So maybe it's an inclination for us. We don't I don't personally. I'd say most people here wouldn't like the song on the Molly Maguires who portrayed them as drinkers and liars and things like that, and I don't think the film comes across very well. So, but maybe there is a lot of mythology around people who military defend workers, and was there a need for that and whatever. The other point, up to present day, like there's another event going to take place in Cork, the Mother Jones Festival, and it was on last year, and it's on again this year, the 12th of July, and it does kind of celebrate the involvement of people like that lady from Cork who went over and helped organise a radical kind of trade union movement in America, like, you know. So there was a lot of kind of radical revolution kind of Irish people involved in the labour movement in the US as well, you know.
Yeah, I think it was just the whole idea of organised labour was a new idea at the time. So I mean, it was new for the bosses to have to deal with. I think it was also new for the workers as well. I think, you know, sure, some of these people who were called Maguires maybe just fell back in the old ways that they knew. You know, that, you know, I know how to, you know, threaten somebody and, you know, punish him if he continues to be unfair to us. And maybe the whole organized labor and, you know, long strikes and things like that are a new concept for them also. So yeah, they definitely. I mean, there definitely was violence. There were these killings. There were, you know, and some of them were planned and organized. I mean, they would have somebody from one town would go over to the next town and, you know, it's sort of, I'll do your murder and you come over to my town and do my murder. So they would exchange murders and things like that. So there was organization behind it, but then sometimes it was just, as I said too, it was just, you know, random violence that was blamed on a conspiracy.
Thanks very much for your talk tonight. I'm just coming to this kind of with not much information at all, so I was intrigued to hear your talk and to hear the background. But my kind of concern is coming away from it is that I can't get a firm grasp of whether they existed or not, or whether this is myth or whether this is the story that's put out by the right-wing press or whatever. So I'd just like to ask you, who have obviously done a lot of history and a study on this, what is your position about did they exist and what was their role, rather than give myths and that, just what's your read on this?
There probably was, you know, a small number of people that perhaps called themselves that, and some of it, and I think one thing that's probably you can't really dispute is that it was wildly exaggerated. Whatever really happened is not what came down to us at first. I mean, the initial stories. So yeah, there probably was a secret, because as I said, it was sort of a tradition of secret societies that went back, you know, to the 18th century. So they probably did form some sort of secret society. Maybe they used the AOH as a cover or as a place to meet, you know, in the AOH lodges or something like that. But I don't think it was anything as grandiose as what they were accused of.
Just before I go down the route, I'll just make my own comment. I just agree with Tom's analysis of the level of violence. The violence from the bosses and from the employers is consistent. John showed what was rallied against the workers in Pennsylvania. It was the newspapers, it was the church supporting the employers, it was the employers. You would have had the military and you would have had the police, and then the private police on the side. Exactly what we had in Dublin in 1913. And I think the response from the workers to the violence that was being used against them was of that time. The Maguires were in a situation where they were carrying the traditions of Ireland that had to take place in the land wars, and they used that to respond. But by 1914, the tradition in Ireland was different. There was open military formations on the street up north, and Carson called them out, and they responded in kind in Dublin with the citizenry, which basically I would see them in the same tradition. The Maguires were, in my mind, workers' defenders against attacks, and so the Citizen Army. I just think it's appropriate that we have on one side the flag of the Citizen Army, and we have, which I should have made clearer earlier, we have that brilliant banner from the Transport and General Workers Union that Chair actually designed. So that would be my opinion on the level of violence, and I think the banners would kind of suggest that that tradition has been recognised in Ireland.
Actually, I had one other quote I wanted to read, which related to a question we had before about how people feel about it now, about the Maguires now. Because basically 100 years later, in 1878, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania actually pardoned Jack Kehoe, who was supposed to be the king of the Mollies. And it said, this is the statement that actually was put on a sign in that town. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania granted posthumous pardon to Kehoe, reflecting the judgment of many historians that the trials and executions were part of a repression directed against the fledgling mine workers union of that historic period. So that's an official statement from Pennsylvania itself. So we recognize that at least Kehoe and some others were unfairly convicted.
Sorry, just again, I suppose it's the two kind of parallel stories that are interesting. But you drew up the list of all the people that were actually murdered. Was that the list?
Yeah.
So obviously somebody organised it. And as you said, they often did it from one community to the other. So has any history shown up who was behind the organisation? Were any names ever found to have, because I mean, that obviously involved quite a bit of...
There was some, I think some of the men that were hanged actually did commit the crimes, and they actually and confessed, and even said, but the vast majority of them said that they were innocent. They probably, maybe the murders were committed by lower level, more figures, but they went after Kehoe and Campbell and these other people that were seen as leaders, as because they wanted to get rid of them. But again, yeah, it's a very shadowy sort of thing. It's a very one-sided history that we have, so it's hard to know exactly what happened. So it's.
Sorry, my second question is that you said there were a lot of them were Irish speaking, but they were recruited in from Donegal. Did somebody bring them over en masse, or what happened? Or do we know how they came from Donegal to the mines?
Not very sure about exactly why that is. It's probably the same thing. The patterns of immigration. I think you get certain people that are there, and then they send for their relatives, and then it just informs us of
well, we know that a lot of Donegal people went to Scotland taking the data, so that's a clear connection there. But because it was in the last year, there's been 300 men who were found that died building railways around Pennsylvania.
That's right. Yeah. What's the Gap? Something Gap. My sister's here, Patty Archer, also from Pennsylvania.
And they died of fever, didn't they?
Well, they also say that they supposedly died of fever, but then didn't they find bullet wounds or something? They were killed.
Yeah. And what they also think were Donegal?
Yeah, fever, but then they found them and said that they were shot. So it wasn't, I mean, I think some of them were, but they definitely found a great number of them had been shot.
And were they Donegal as well, of notion? They were Donegal?
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of Donegal people in Pennsylvania in general. Growing up in Philadelphia, it seemed like I knew a lot of people who were grandparents from Donegal. There were some from Mayo and from Canada. It was sort of north central, but really preponderance of people from Donegal.
John, I can see 3 hands up, so I've got to go around there, and if there's anyone else that hasn't asked a question, maybe give them a chance, because we have a few things to wrap up afterwards. So it's yourself, Maureen, and the gentleman at the back. And if there's anyone else, put your hand up soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed for the very interesting talk. I came with an open mind, and I didn't really know much at all about the Maguires. But what struck me, you did concentrate obviously on Pennsylvania and situation there. Were the Maguires, or that name, or that title, or tag, or whatever, put on other groups in other parts of the states? And is there any connection with some of the kind of criminal elements that grew up in the early 20th century, going back to Maguire? Or was it just a name that could be easily labelled and tossed around all over? But did situations that Maguires, did they exist outside of Pennsylvania?
I don't think so, but I do think it was used as a label to paint other organizations. Like when other unions would start out, they say, "Oh, these are the Maguires again." So it was just to discourage, organized labor, to label them as terrorists. And the word terrorist was actually thrown around all the time, which is interesting. The term goes back that far. Yeah.
I thought that was a new word. Thank you.
Sure. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the play as well, because it's just there's so many themes in this that have to do with things that are happening today, with terrorism, immigration, corporate greed, the media, all these things that are still going on in America today.
I read a lot about the Molly Maguires. I'm a Maguire, and my husband was a miner.
Really?
So yeah. I met a Presbyterian when I was working, a minister from Pennsylvania, And he talked quite a lot about Molly Maguires, and because of the name and everything else, I was always very interested and read most of the books about the Molly Maguires. Now, the areas that they came from was Mayo and also Donegal, and there was a history there before they ever went over there of boycotting and also of murdering, you know, landlords. So it wouldn't have been unknown to them. And it worked because they did get people. I mean, when the landlord was dead, the whole family then disappeared off to wherever. So as far as I was concerned, it did work. And their backs were against the wall because the places they lived in belonged to the miners as well. So if their husbands got killed, the women and children were out in the street. So that was it. And they were backs against the wall. And then they kept reducing the wages as well. So, you know, they were justified in doing, they really didn't feel that they had any option other than to do it. And it worked, as far as I was concerned, it worked in Ireland. Why wouldn't it work there?
Right, and I think that's why they fell back on the old ways when, you know, when the union started to fall apart and the strikes got weaker.
Thank you. My name is John Barrett. I'm originally from County Mayo. My grandfather worked in the mines in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, really?
I remember saying on one occasion, a neighbour questioned about not being able to speak much Irish. He said there wasn't a lot of Irish, he said, in the mines in Scranton in Pennsylvania. But he would have worked there about when he was 15 years of age, he said. I just have vague memories of him. But that would be after, that would be the 1880s, early 1890s. But then he returned to Ireland and he lived there. But there was a big connection between the west of Ireland and that area because the boats would have left from the official ports of Sligo, Derry and that, and Galway, and they would have topped up along the coast sometimes because they were only allowed to take on so many at the official ports. But they would have sent in tenders and taken on people from the coastline. That would be the Balmoral area and that, and Akin area, North Mayo.
Yeah, and the Kevin Kenny book does point that out, that there were Molly Maguires from Mayo as well, but they tended to be, as you said, from more remote areas of Mayo. And, but he actually does an analysis of all of the names involved, the names of the people, and it's a preponderance of Donegal names, although they are from other parts of Ireland too. Just to the north and west, yeah.
Just another thing, changing the subject slightly, about the 1913 lockout and strike. I'm very disappointed that it's not celebrated properly. Seemingly, they were refused to put a float in the St. Patrick's Day parade commemorating the 1913 strike and lockout. I was very disappointed. I know it was a non-political, non-religious group that were organising it, but I don't think we have recognised that. That's something that comes from the rural Ireland.
The Dublin St. Patrick's Day?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. What's the AOH that runs the New York St. Patrick's Day?
They will not have floats like this either.
There no floats at all.
Okay. We are under a bit of time pressure with the building as well, and as I said, they're very good to us, but they're not that good. They let us stay after close now. So we have a couple of other things that we want to do. So, is there any last questions for John before we thank him and let him wrap up? Thank you, John.
Well, thank you for joining.
Okay,
thank you very much for having me, Francis. And I have a couple of books over there for sale if you'd like to buy them outside.
Yeah, when we wrap up, people can hang around and buy some books and stuff. Now, before we just wrap up on the Molly Maguires, just again, I said it already, but thanks very much to Scott Miller from Liberty magazine and Lockout, who organised the loan of that banner. We had to sign for it and it has to go back tomorrow. But it was great that they let it out. I actually remember seeing that on a march years ago, so it's a wonderful opportunity to have it here. So if people want to take their pictures with it afterwards, it doesn't be out very often. We can take them for you and pass them on to you. But it's, again, thanks for the banner. Just to finish up on the Molly Maguires, you're not getting class, sorry. Dermot is going to come down and sing a song. Scott as well. Thank you.
Okay, somebody earlier on mentioned one about their liars and their drunkards and so on. That's the song that most of us would have heard about the Maguires, and I always thought it was crap. I didn't think the film was that bad, actually. I quite identified with Sean Connery in that, and the people that he was playing. But I came across this other song written by, I think, an Irish-American group, ballad group in the States. And one of the questions I asked, and one of the people mentioned it, it's reasonably short. You can join in on the last line if you like. There isn't a chorus in it. When the wind blows wild at night, past the breakers melancholy, if you stand in the dark with your ears to the wind, you can hear the sons of Molly. Deep in the dark of the old mine shaft, you can smell the smoke and the fire, and the whisper low from the mine below is the voice of Molly Maguire. Why, I tell you boys, Edward Kelly is my name, and I come from Carvin County. And I shot the boss of the Lansford mine, now my soul is up for bounty. But I will die with my head held high, for I fought for the men below, those men who toil and sweat and die down in the dark hellhole. Why, I tell you boys, Mickey Doyle is my name, and I'm for hanging in the morning. Sorry, I tell you boys, Mickey Doyle is my name, I'm for hanging in the morning. For I stabbed Jack Jones for skinning my bones, how I hate the sound of mourning. But I will die with my head held high, for I fought for the men below, those men who toil and sweat and die down in the dark hellhole. Why, I tell you boys, Alec Campbell is my name, and a pistol did I fire. But I will fall from the gallows wall just for being a Molly Maguire. And I will die with my head held high, for I fought for the men below, those men who toil and sweat and die down in the dark hellhole. When the wind blows wild at night, past the breakers melancholy, if you stand in the dark with your ears to the wind, you can hear the sons of Molly. Deep in the dark of the old mine shaft, you can smell the smoke and the fire, and the whisper low from the mine below is the voice of Molly Maguire.
I appreciate that Dermot came down to sing, and I'd like to have more time. It's terrible to move somebody on to do a raffle, but unfortunately we have to make